Factions have been a part of Counter-Strike for the last 25 years. From the very first beta to now, well, it's just these two. But interestingly enough, every faction in Counter-Strike has a story, some of which is fictional and some of which is based on real life. So let's begin with the very first one, the Phoenix Connection. This on your screens is the very first terrorist model added in Counter-Strike. It was in 1999 in beta 1.0 and it was called the Irish Republic Army, which was an actual terrorist organization that tried to bring together Ireland. However, literally in the next update, the name was changed to the Phoenix faction, and by the release of Counter-Strike 1.0, it was called the Phoenix Connection. The lore of this faction is the following. They are an Eastern European organization that was formed after the break of the USSR that has murdered over 100 people and are responsible for various terrorist attacks in Romania, Spain, Czechia and Yugoslavia. They're also pretty good with explosives. Over the years, the character model has changed. They don't have the white camo pants anymore, and there is also a Phoenix logo in the middle of their chest, which is from the CSGO storyline. By the way, here are some cool voice lines they said in CSGO.
No more talking, now we fight! You will cry like babies before you die!
Towards the end of CS Global Offensive, some purchasable variants were also released, and in CS2 they are the only map-based terrorist faction that is left in the game. The Arab Man. This was the second terrorist faction to be added, and the model was a reskinned version of Gordon Freeman from Half-Life. However, as you can obviously tell, the name on the model were a bit controversial, so they were quickly changed to this one with the name Duracell, then the name Middle Eastern, then L337 Crew, and finally the Elite Crew. This hands down was the most used model in CS 1.6, and their story is quite gruesome compared to the Phoenix Connection. According to the lore, they are a Middle Eastern organization that has killed over 2,000 people, with targets in the US, UK, France and Israel. They were most notorious for wiping out a whole cruise ship by poisoning the water supply and for hijacking a plane in 1989 called Fly Friendly Airlines Flight 983, and they also executed the pilot on live TV. Obviously this is all fiction, but when I typed out the flight name, Google directed me to something similar that had happened with Air France Flight 8969, where a terrorist group from Algeria hijacked the plane, killed 4 people and were then eliminated by the GI Jin, which is a counter-terrorist organization in Counter-Strike. Pretty interesting. Anyway, over the years the model of the Elite Crew has evolved. The source one was definitely questionable. In CSGO the model also saw some remakes, as there were various versions including a black one. But sadly, towards the end, Valve released some purchasable versions before completely removing the faction in CS2. SEAL Team 6. I think it's about time that we talked about the very first CT faction. SEAL Team 6, or now known as DevGru, is an actual American Special Forces unit in real life that was made in 1980 after a failed rescue mission in Iran. SEAL Team 6 started off with a blue character model in the beta, which was then changed to this green one and has stayed that way until these 2 scuba agents were added in CSGO. Some cool voice lines said by the faction were these.
That is pristine! Let's do this and get back in time for chow.
But sadly, in CS2, they are not the main faction. It's instead the SAS, which was added in beta 5.0 with this triangle head character model that was later fixed a few times before receiving its final version in CS 1.6. The SAS definitely became very iconic over the next few releases of Counter-Strike before we reached CSGO, which is where it received a couple more changes to its character model. And of course, how can we forget the iconic British voice lines?
Are we rushing in? Or are we going sneaky beaky like?
The SAS is obviously the UK Special Force unit and was established during the Second World War, and they very quickly became very notorious for conducting various Counter-Strike operations, one of which was the Iranian embassy siege, where they successfully rescued most of the hostages live on TV. In CS2, the SAS is the only CT faction left in the game. Moving on to my personal favorite faction, the Arctic Avengers. The Arctic Avengers were added in beta 6.0 and are the only faction to have not made an appearance in Global Offensive or in CS2. Valve, please fix. Originally known as the Snow Guy, the lore states that this faction was founded in Sweden in 1977 and became famous for bombing the Canadian embassy, and have claimed the responsibility for 300 political assassinations and 2,000 civilian deaths. Within deleted scenes, the Arctic Avengers were always associated with some sort of nuclear bombings, which is a bit unusual for the Swedes. Anyway, the Arctic Avengers also have a diary called the Diary of Arctic Man Joe that was posted on the Counter-Strike website about 25 years ago. It has quite a lot of pages and some interesting stories, which you can find the link to in the description, where I would also appreciate if you could subscribe if you are enjoying the video so far. Guerilla Warfare. This was the last faction from the first 4 to be added in the Counter-Strike series, and it was clearly inspired by Rambo, with the red bandana, the camouflage trousers, and the boots. In regards to the lore, the Guerilla Warfare is the largest and best equipped faction in the whole world. They originate from the Middle East and they hate Americans, which is why they decided to bomb up school bus full of rock and roll musicians, which is a bit odd. But a big problem is that in Counter-Strike deleted scenes, which is basically like the story mode of CS, the storyline for the faction is completely different. They instead originate from South America and operate as a cartel with different motives than before. Over the years, the player model saw some minimal changes, but sadly the faction wasn't added in CSGO until in 2021 as a purchasable agent as a part of Operation Riptide, which is where we saw the biggest changes to the character models. Along the years, we also saw a skin with a reference to the faction and a sticker. The last 2 factions from this part of the video are the GIGN and the GSG9, which are the CTs on the loading screen of CS 1.6. Both of these factions, like the last 2 counter-terrorist organizations, are real. The GIGN is the French unit against terrorism, and as I said earlier, they became famous for stopping a plane hijacking in 1994. And the GSG9 is the German equivalent and were formed after the Munich massacre at the Olympic Games. The player model for the GIGN originally started off by wearing a balaclava, but after Counter-Strike Condition Zero, they also adopted helmets with visors similar to the GSG9 all the way till the end of CSGO. Unlike the other CT factions, the GIGN and the GSG9 do not have any purchasable agents, and as a result are completely removed from CS2, which I think is a great shame, as these 2 counter-terrorist organizations were literally featured in every promotional poster of Counter-Strike, even in the CSGO trailer. And on top of this, the GIGN was used in the door stuck meme, making it even more iconic. But that is it for the first era of factions in Counter-Strike. Let's move on to the next one. Counter-Strike deleted scenes and Counter-Strike Condition Zero. For those of you wondering, during Counter-Strike Source there were no new factions that were added, but during Condition Zero and deleted scenes we saw 5 new factions, all 5 of which were also on the Xbox version of the game. Let's talk about the Akunin and the Kitodai. The Akunin were basically the Japanese Yakuza, who appeared in some of the missions within deleted scenes. The models looked a bit funny to me, especially this guy, but they didn't appear in any other Counter-Strike game, even though there was some concept art for CSGO. The Kitodai are the Japanese unit which represents the counter-terrorists within these missions. They too didn't make it into any other Counter-Strike game, and neither did the Spetsnaz or the Midwest Militia. So I'm not going to talk about any of them except for the SWAT organization, as they were later introduced into CSGO. Initially the SWAT model was green and blue and was later changed to this grey model when released in the CSGO beta. Then Valve ended up releasing some more purchasable agents. I'm starting to see a bit of a trend here. Anyway, the SWAT faction is a real-life organization just like every other CT one we have spoken about so far. However, the SWAT team isn't exactly responsible for counter-terrorist activities. They are more so a police department on steroids within various states of the US, which leads us nicely onto Counter-Strike Global Offensive, where a lot of new factions were added. Starting off with the newest faction, the Balkans. Obviously originating from Southeast Europe, the Balkans were added in the beta of CSGO, and unlike other factions, they don't really have any lore except for the fact that they're Balkan. They did however have some cool voice lines, and in particular this agent called Ido became a big meme at one point. Let's move on to the Separatists. This is probably the most controversial faction to have ever been added, as Valve literally stated that they will be basing them off the ETA, a real-life terrorist organization based in the Basque region of Spain and France. This was so controversial that the Spanish government asked Valve to remove the faction, which they didn't because they have massive arms. Despite the fact that they no longer exist in CS2 as there were no purchasable agents, they still exist in the form of stickers. Now you're probably wondering, what did ETA even do for the Spanish government to get involved? Well, apart from killing 800 people, a couple of important political figures, and killing the new Prime Minister of Spain, as well as also bombing an airport, they didn't do nothing much. The goal for ETA was to gain independence for their region, which is what they kind of achieved in the end, and they kind of didn't achieve. Moving on to the professionals, who were added with the official launch of CSGO and looked like this. They are not a group with a political agenda, but rather mercenaries with a financial goal, which is why we see them on Bank, Agency, Vertigo and other maps, or at least we used to. The model stayed the same until in 2019, which is when much cooler paid alternatives were added to the game. In general, the faction seems to be inspired by the film Reservoir Dogs that is based on a bank heist with the characters looking relatively similar, which leaves us with the last 2 terrorist factions that were added in CSGO, the pirates and the anarchists. The pirates are clearly based off the real-life Somali pirates who are very infamous, and the anarchists are meant to represent young freedom fighters, probably inspired by the Black Bloc movement. However, both these factions, unlike the others, are pretty niche. They never appeared in many of the maps and are generally pretty forgotten by the community, which is a shame as they do look pretty cool. But then again, they seem to have all been replaced or forgotten due to the mass amount of purchasable agents that were added to the game in 2019, which we will talk about in a second after we cover the only two counter-terrorist factions that were added in CSGO, the FBI and the IDF. When first introduced, the FBI had this green look to them before it was changed in 2018 to this blue version. The IDF, on the other hand, never received any changes to its character models. Now, I think everyone knows who the FBI are, so I'm not going to sit here and explain what they do, but I will mention the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Force, or in other words, the Israeli police/military. Which brings us to 2019, Doomsday. After 2019, it was clear what turn Valve were going to take with factions. With the introduction of a shitload of purchasable agents, the overall removal of map-based factions was inevitable. Although the whole community hates on Valve because they are a money printing machine, I think from their POV it was probably the right decision, although I will miss them as they did add some sort of story to such a competitively focused game. However, what I would urge Valve to do is to add more factions like the Arctic Avengers that we all would love to see. Let me know what faction was your personal favorite in the comments, and also consider subscribing if you did like this video, as the support means a lot for me.